The report of the rifle was a flat, dead sound in the vast emptiness of Diablo Canyon. It was followed by the whine of a ricochet, a hornet's buzz, that sang past Jake Ryder's ear and chipped a shard of granite from the boulder he used for cover. Dust and stone fragments peppered his cheek. He didn't flinch. He was a man made of stillness, carved from the same unforgiving rock that surrounded him. Another shot. This one thudded into the sun-bleached carcass of a long-dead mule 20 feet away, kicking up a puff of desiccated hide. Sloppy. Desperate. Give it up, Calloway. Jake's voice was a low rasp, scraped raw by dust and disuse. Nowhere left to run. A wheezing laugh echoed from the jumble of rocks across the narrow wash. That's what you think, Marshal. I always got one more place to run. Not a marshal anymore. Jake said more to himself than to the man he was hunting. The words tasted like ash. He slowly, methodically reloaded the single empty chamber in his Colt Peacemaker. The click of the cylinder turning was the only sound that seemed to have meaning in the crushing silence that followed. He'd been tracking Silas Calloway for 3 days, a 2-bit cattle rustler with a $500 bounty on his head. But it wasn't the money. It was the chase, the familiar rhythm of the hunt that kept the ghosts at bay. Out here under a sky, the color of a faded bruise, the past was a distant hum. In the quiet of a town, in the 4 walls of a room, it was a roar. Jake eased his head around the edge of the boulder. Gunsmoke, thin and acrid, coiled in the windless air above Calloway's position. He saw a flash of movement, a dirty plaid shirt, a glint of metal. Jake fired, not to kill, but to pin down. The bullet slammed into the rock inches from Calloway's hiding spot, and a yelp of surprise followed. "You're getting slow," Ryder Calloway taunted, his voice tight with fear. "Used to be you'd have put that one right between my eyes." Jake didn't answer. He shifted his worn leather chaps, scraping against the rock. The sun hammered down, turning the canyon floor into a skillet. Sweat traced clean paths through the grime on his face. He was patient. Calloway had 1 canteen and a 6-gun with maybe 2 rounds left. Jake had time. Time was all he had. An endless barren expanse of it stretching back to the night of the fire. The night he lost everything. "You know I heard about you." Ryder Calloway's voice was louder now, edged with a strange confidence. "Heard all about your pretty wife. Eleanor, wasn't it?" Jake's blood went cold. His grip tightened on the Colt until his knuckles were white. The hum in his head became a sharp, piercing whine. "Such a shame," Calloway continued, his words slithering across the canyon. "A fine woman like that trapped in a burning house. And her hero of a husband, the great Marshal Ryder, out chasing some no-account drifter. Too late to save her. Too late for anything but watching the flames eat her alive." Every word was a nail driven into a wound that would not heal. Jake's breath hitched. How could a cheap rustler like Calloway know her name? Know the details that haunted his every waking moment? "Who told you that?" Jake's voice was dangerously low. "Oh, a fella. A real gentleman. Pays well for information. Pays even better for a man's services." Calloway fired his last shot, a wild, panicked round that went nowhere near Jake. "He knew everything about you, Ryder. Knew where you'd be. Knew what to say to get under your skin. Said to tell you that some debts, they never burn away." The silence that followed was absolute. Calloway was out of ammunition. It was over. Jake rose from behind the boulder, the Colt held steady in his hand. He walked across the sun-blasted earth, his spurs jingling a somber death knell. Silas Calloway scrambled out from his cover hands, raised a pathetic figure with fear-widened eyes and a trembling lip. "Don't shoot, I'm worth more alive," he pleaded. Jake stopped 10 feet from him, his shadow falling long and dark over the outlaw. "The man who hired you. What was his name?" "I don't know. Honest to God, I never saw his face proper. Always in the shadows. Wore fine clothes, though. Spoke like a schoolmaster." Calloway was babbling now, shrinking under Jake's cold gaze. He said, you were a man who built his life on a foundation of ash, and it was time to collect the cinder. Jake's eyes scanned the ground around Calloway's hiding spot. Something caught the light, a glint of brass. He walked over and knelt, pushing aside a loose stone. It was a spent bullet casing, but it wasn't from Calloway's gun or his own. It was a rifle shell, heavy and custom-made. On its base, where the manufacturer's mark should be, was a small, exquisitely tooled engraving, a single thorny rose. He'd seen a casing just like it once before. At the scene of a train robbery 2 years ago, a case he'd never solved. A case that had pulled him away from home for 3 days. The 3 days that ended with him returning to a smoking ruin where his house once stood. He picked up the casing, its metal still warm from the sun. It felt heavy in his palm, a tangible piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was meant to solve. A puzzle built from his own private hell. He holstered his Colt and pulled a pair of manacles from his belt. "Get on your feet, Calloway. You've got a long walk ahead of you." As he secured the rustler's wrists, Calloway looked at the casing in Jake's hand. "He left that, didn't he? The fella who hired me. Said it was a calling card. Said you'd understand." Jake looked from the engraved rose to the distant horizon, a shimmering lines of heat and dust. For the first time in a year, the ghost of his grief had a shape. It was no longer a random act of fate that had taken Eleanor. It was a plan, and he was standing in the middle of it. The hunt he thought he was leading had been leading him all along. The journey to the town of redemption was a pilgrimage through purgatory. The sun hammered the cracked earth into a mosaic of baked clay, and the air tasted of dust and distant thunder that never came. Jake rode in silence, Calloway stumbling along on a lead rope tied to his saddle horn. The landscape was a study in beige and ochre, broken only by the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti reaching for a merciless sky. Redemption appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, a place where the heat shimmer congealed into something solid. As they drew closer, it took shape a single dusty street lined with raw lumber buildings, their false fronts leaning like tired old men. It was a town caught between a hard past and an uncertain future, its name a desperate prayer whispered into the wilderness. They passed the blacksmith's shop where the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel was the town's heartbeat. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to watch him pass, their faces weathered and guarded. They knew him. Jake Ryder had been the marshal here once before the fire, before the man they respected had been replaced by this hollow-eyed specter. He felt their stares like a physical weight. They were a mix of pity and suspicion. A man who couldn't protect his own wife, what good was he? He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, a small squat building with a faded sign and barred windows. He hauled Calloway up the steps and shoved him through the door. The air inside was cool and smelled of stale coffee and ink. Sheriff Ben Miller sat behind a cluttered desk, a bear of a man whose size was starting to soften with age. His silver-streaked hair was thinning, and the tin star on his vest seemed to weigh him down. He looked up over his spectacles, his expression shifting from weariness to surprise. "Jake, by God, I didn't expect to see you ride in. Brought you a present," Ben Jake said, pushing Calloway toward the desk. Silas Calloway. $500 on his head for rustling. Miller eyed the pathetic outlaw. "Heard he was running wild up in the dragoons? Good work." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Wish I had more men like you were." The unspoken words hung in the air before you fell apart. "Lock him up," Jake said, ignoring the comment. He tossed the engraved bullet casing onto the desk. It landed with a soft clink. "And hold on to this. Evidence." Miller picked it up, turning it over in his thick fingers. "A thorny rose, never seen a mark like it." "Where'd you find it?" "A friend of Calloway's left it for me." Before Miller could ask more, the door swung open again. A man stood silhouetted against the blinding sunlight. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, a stark contrast to the dust-caked town. As he stepped inside, his features resolved into a mask of polite, calculated charm. His hair was the color of dark honey, his eyes a pale, piercing blue. This was Elias Thorne. Sheriff Miller Thorne said, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "I was hoping to find you. I have the final deed for the old McGregor place. All perfectly legal, of course." He placed a sheaf of papers on the corner of Miller's desk, his movements economical and precise. His gaze flickered to Jake, a flicker of what might have been recognition or perhaps just appraisal. Mr. Ryder Thorne acknowledged with a slight nod. "Back in town. I trust your time in the wilderness was restorative." It was quiet, Jake said, his eyes narrowing. He'd seen Thorne around town for the past 6 months. The man had arrived with a fat wallet and a vision of progress, buying up failing ranches, promising investment, and slowly tightening his grip on redemption's resources. Some, like the mayor and the merchants, saw him as a savior. Others, the ranchers being squeezed out, saw him as a vulture circling a dying animal. "Indeed," Thorne said with a thin smile, "though civilization has its own rewards. Speaking of which, Sheriff, my men are on their way to the Martinez property to serve the foreclosure notice. I anticipate a smooth transition." Miller looked down at his desk, avoiding Thorne's gaze. "Elias, the Martinez family, has been on that land for 30 years. Clara's trying her best since her father passed. Can't you give her a little more time?" "Time is a luxury." Sheriff Thorne replied, his tone hardening almost imperceptibly. "I extended her loan twice. Business is business. The law is on my side." He turned his smile back to Jake. "Isn't that right, Mr. Ryder? A man of the law must respect the letter of it above all else." The veiled challenge was unmistakable. Jake felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He looked at Ben Miller, at the resignation in his old friend's eyes. The law was losing its purchase in redemption. It was being replaced by money and paper, wielded by men like Elias Thorne. Without a word, Jake turned and walked out of the office, the hot sun hitting him like a physical blow. He knew the Martinez place. It was 5 miles out, a stubborn patch of green carved out of the desert by a family's sweat and blood. And he knew Thorne's men, hired guns who preferred to let their pistols do the talking. He strode to his horse, a big roan gelding that had carried him through hell and back. He didn't know why he was doing this. It wasn't his town to protect anymore. It wasn't his fight. But the image of Calloway's sneer, the memory of Eleanor's name on a killer's lips, and the cold weight of the engraved casing in his pocket had fused into a single sharp point of purpose. Something was rotten in redemption, and its stench led straight to the man in the tailored black suit. As he swung into the saddle, he knew one thing for sure. Elias Thorne's smooth transition was about to hit a snag. The Martinez ranch was nestled in a small valley, a testament to decades of stubborn labor. A modest adobe house stood sentinel over irrigated fields, and a sturdy corral held a half-dozen healthy-looking horses. Cottonwood trees, a rare luxury, lined a creek that fed the property. It was a place built to last, but as Jake crested the final rise, he saw it was a place under siege. 4 men on horseback sat facing the house, their postures arrogant and impatient. A 5th, a burly foreman Jake recognized as Jed Cutter, was nailing a notice to the front door. A young woman stood on the porch, her small frame rigid with defiance. Clara Martinez. Jake remembered her as a girl with pigtails trailing her father around the general store. Now she held a Winchester rifle, and the look in her dark eyes was anything but childish. "I'm telling you for the last time," Cutter Clara's voice was clear and steady, carrying across the yard. "Get off my land." Cutter chuckled a low, guttural sound. "This ain't your land anymore, sweetheart. It belongs to Mr. Thorne now." This here paper makes it official." He tapped the notice with a grimy finger. "That paper is an eviction notice. Not a deed," she countered, her knuckles white on the rifle. "And it needs to be served by the sheriff, not by a pack of hired thugs." "The sheriff's—" Busy Cutter sneered. "Mr. Thorne sent us to expedite the process. Now be a good girl and step aside. We're just here to take inventory before we move you out." Jake urged his horse into a slow walk, emerging from the cover of the rocks onto the open track leading to the house. All 5 men turned at the sound of his approach. Cutter's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Ryder, I might have known you'd stick your nose in." Jake brought his horse to a halt between Thorne's men and the porch, creating a clear line. He didn't look at Clara, keeping his attention fixed on Cutter. His hands rested loosely on his thighs, inches from his holstered Colt. "This is Millerstown, Cutter." Jake's voice was low and even. "Legal papers are served by the law, not by hired guns." "The law is whatever Mr. Thorne says it is." Cutter shot back his hand, inching toward his own pistol. "Stay out of this, Ryder. Your hero days are over." From the porch, Clara spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "My father built this ranch with his own hands. You'll take it from my own when they're cold." Her pragmatism was a splash of cold water. This wasn't a plea for help. It was a statement of fact. Jake felt a flicker of admiration. "You heard the lady," Jake said, his eyes locking with Cutter's. "Ride out." Cutter hesitated, weighing his options. He had the numbers, but he was facing Jake Ryder. Even a broken version of the legend was more than most men wanted to test. He glanced at his men, who shifted uneasily in their saddles. "Mr. Thorne ain't gonna like this." Cutter growled a final impotent threat. "I'll be sure to send him my condolences," Jake replied. With a curse, Cutter wheeled his horse around. "Let's go. We'll be back." With the sheriff this time. They galloped away in a cloud of dust and frustration, leaving an uneasy silence in their wake. Only then did Jake turn to face Clara. She hadn't lowered the Winchester. Her gaze was wary, appraising. "I didn't ask for your help, Ryder. I didn't offer it," he said, dismounting. "I just have an aversion to bullies." She finally lowered the rifle, resting its stock on the porch. "Well, thank you, anyway." Her expression softened slightly. "I heard you were back, just passing through." The lie felt thin even to him. "People don't pass through redemption," she said with a wry twist of her lips. "They're either stuck here or running from something. Which is it for you?" He didn't answer, his attention drawn to the foreclosure notice. He ripped it from the door, crumpled it in his fist, and tossed it into the dust. "Thorne won't give up this easily." "I know." The fight went out of her posture, replaced by a weary resolve. "He's been strangling this valley for months. A blight, a suspicious fire at the McGregor place, a lost herd of cattle for the Jacksons. Always after a tragedy, he's there with an offer. Or a foreclosure." Jake's head snapped up. "A fire. Last spring. McGregor's barn burned to the ground. He lost his whole winter stock. Ruined him. Thorne bought the land for pennies on the dollar." A cold dread trickled down Jake's spine. Did they find out how it started? Clara shrugged. "Sheriff Miller said it was a lantern kicked over by a cow. Said it was an accident. An accident. The same word they used for the fire that took Eleanor. The same convenient explanation that left no one to blame but fate. Or a careless husband." "He'll be back," Ryder, Clara said, pulling him from his thoughts. "With the law on his side next time. Then we'd better be ready." The words came out before he could stop them. It had been a long time since he'd used that word. That evening, a liveried boy delivered a summons. An embossed card requesting Mr. Ryder's presence at the Redemption Grand Hotel for a private dinner with Mr. Elias Thorne. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The hotel was Thorne's monument to himself. An opulent 2-story structure of polished wood and gleaming brass that loomed over the town's humble buildings. Thorne was waiting for him in a private dining room, a bottle of expensive whiskey and 2 crystal glasses on the table between them. Mr. Ryder. Thank you for coming, Thorne said, gesturing to the empty chair. I believe you and I have some business to discuss. I'm not for sale, Thorne. Thorne smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and pushed one across the table. Oh, I think you misunderstand. I'm not looking to buy your loyalty. I'm simply advising you on the wisdom of staying out of matters that don't concern you. The Martinez Ranch, for instance. It concerned me. An unfortunate sentiment, Thorne said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Progress is often disruptive to those who cling to the past. Redemption needs a firm hand to guide it into the future. I am providing that hand. He took a sip of a whiskey, his pale blue eyes cold and unblinking. You, on the other hand, are a relic, a ghost of a lawman haunting a town that has moved on. There's no place for you here anymore. The veiled threat was as sharp as a stiletto. Jake ignored the whiskey. Funny thing about ghosts, Jake said, his voice flat. They tend to linger when there's unfinished business. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. Like unsolved fires, or custom-made ammunition. Thorne's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something annoyance passed through his eyes. You speak in riddles, Mr. Ryder. A rustler I brought in today mentioned a man who pays well for information. A man who knew things about my past. He left a calling card. How intriguing. Thorne said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. This town is full of gossip and shadows. One must be careful what one believes. He leaned back, the picture of calm control. Let me be direct. Your interference today was a nuisance. Continue to be a nuisance, and you will find that even a ghost can be exorcised. There are tragedies in this world, Ryder. Some are acts of God. Some, he paused, his gaze boring into Jake, are man-made. It would be a shame for you to suffer another. The message was delivered. A threat wrapped in a condolence, a warning hidden in plain sight. Jake stood up, the untouched whiskey, a silent refusal of Thorne's poisoned hospitality. I'll keep that in mind, he said. He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the knob. You're right about one thing, Thorne. I am a ghost. And you know what ghosts do best. They dig up what's been buried. As he walked out into the cool night air, the pieces began to click into place. The fire, the rustler, the engraved casing. Clara's troubles, they weren't separate events. They were threads in a web, and Elias Thorne sat at its center. This was no longer just about a town's future. It was about Jake's past. And he would tear Thorne's world apart to uncover the truth. The days that followed settled into a tense, watchful rhythm. Jake took a room at the boarding house, a small, clean space that felt more like a cell than a home. He spent his time observing, listening, piecing together the scope of Thorne's operations. It was a slow, painstaking process. Thorne was careful, his power built on legal documents and the quiet intimidation of his hired guns, led by the ever-present Jed Cutter. Jake started with the McGregor fire. He rode out to the blackened remains of the barn, sifting through the debris. There was nothing to find, nothing but charred timber and the faint, lingering smell of defeat. But as he was leaving, he noticed something odd. The tracks of a single-shod horse, old and half-erased by wind, leading away from the back of the property, toward the desolate Badlands, not toward town. It was a trail too cold to follow, but it was a detail that didn't fit the story of a kicked-over lantern. He began spending his evenings with Clara at her ranch. Under the guise of helping her fortify her defenses, they talked. She was a well of information, her fierce love for her home matched by a keen understanding of its people and politics. Thorne's a snake, she said one evening, cleaning the Winchester on her porch as the sun bled across the horizon. He never strikes directly. He waits for you to be weak. After my father died, he sent his condolences. And a week later, his lawyer arrived with a loan offer. And you took it. I had to, she admitted, her jaw tight. We'd had a bad year. A cattle sickness swept through the valley. It hit us hard, hit the Jacksons even harder. The family whose herd was lost, she nodded. They found half the herd dead in a box canyon dehydrated. The other half was just gone. Thorne bought their land a month later. She stopped cleaning the rifle and looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. None of it feels random, Jake. It feels like a strategy, like chess. And he's positioning his pieces for checkmate. Jake thought of the tracks at the McGregor place, of the rustler who was in the right place to hit the Jacksons. He thought of the fire that had destroyed his own life, leaving him weak and vulnerable. He pulled the engraved bullet casing from his pocket. The thorny rose seemed to mock him in the fading light. "I think you're right," he said, showing it to her. "And I think this is one of his pieces." Clara looked at the casing, her brow furrowed. "I've never seen anything like it. Neither has Ben Miller. But it keeps showing up where it shouldn't." Their alliance was forged in those quiet evenings, a bond of mutual respect and shared purpose. He saw in her the resilience he had lost to refusal to be broken, that shamed his own surrender to grief. She in turn seemed to find in his grim determination a source of strength. A subtle warmth grew between them, unspoken, but felt a fragile bloom in a landscape of dust and danger. The first real obstacle came a week later. Acting on a tip from a disgruntled stable hand, Jake learned that a cattle stampede was planned for the herd at the Double R Ranch, owned by the elderly Robertson family. It was the last major ranch in the valley that hadn't yet fallen under Thorne's control. Under the cover of a moonless night, Jake and Clara rode out to the Double R's grazing lands. They found what they were looking for, two of Cutter's men setting up tripwires and canvas sheets designed to spook the cattle and send them stampeding over a cliff edge. The confrontation was swift and silent. Jake moved like a phantom, disabling one man with the butt of his pistol before the other even knew he was there. Clara, proving she was more than capable, covered him with her Winchester. They left the two men tied up and gagged a warning to Thorne that his games were no longer going unnoticed. The next morning, as he walked to the sheriff's office to tell Miller what had happened, he found a small, grim crowd gathered outside. Ben Miller was being carried out on a stretcher, a blood-soaked bandage around his shoulder. "What happened?" Jake demanded, pushing through the crowd. A deputy, a young man with fear in his eyes, looked at Jake. "Ambush, just outside of town." Sheriff was riding out to check on the Robertsons. Someone was waiting for him. Jake's blood ran cold. The stampede was a diversion. The real target was the law itself. With Miller out of commission, the town was effectively neutered. Thorne had anticipated Jake's move and countered with brutal efficiency. He pushed his way into the office. Jed Cutter was there, leaning against the wall with a smug look on his face. "Terrible business," Cutter said, feigning sympathy. "This country's getting more dangerous by the day." "Get out," Jake said, his voice a low growl. "The acting mayor put me in charge of a town watch until the sheriff is back on his feet." Cutter said, tapping a newly pinned deputy's badge on his chest. "On Mr. Thorne's recommendation, of course. For public safety." The pieces snapped into place. Thorne hadn't just removed the sheriff. He'd replaced him with his own man. He now controlled the law in redemption. Jake was no longer just an investigator. He was an outlaw in his own town. Clara found him later at the livery checking the loads in his Colt. The news of Miller's ambush and Cutter's promotion had spread through the town like a fever. "It's my fault," Jake said, not looking at her. "I pushed, and Thorne pushed back harder. Ben got caught in the middle." "This isn't on you, Jake," she said, her voice firm. "This is on Thorne. You didn't start this war. You just chose to fight in it." She hesitated for a moment. "My father used to keep old records. Deeds, birth certificates, business dealings. He always said you can learn more from a man's paperwork than from his words. The records are in the back room of the general store. Maybe there's something in there. Something about Thorne." It was a long shot, but it was all they had. That night, they slipped into the darkened general store. The back room was a dusty archive of Redemption's history filled with ledgers and boxes of aging documents. For hours they pored over the records by the light of a single lantern, the smell of old paper and leather thick in the air. They found records of Thorne's land purchases, all meticulously legal. They found deeds tracing back decades. Then, in a dusty box marked Territorial Census and Family Records. Clara pulled out a sheaf of papers. "This is odd," she said. "It's a family record from St. Louis dated 30 years ago. The Ashworth family? It must have been sent here with some settlers by mistake." Jake was about to dismiss it when a name caught his eye. "Let me see that." He took the paper, his hand trembling slightly as he read the names. Father Daniel Ashworth, Mother Mary Ashworth, daughter Eleanor Ashworth, son Elias Ashworth. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from Jake's lungs. Eleanor Ashworth, his wife, her maiden name. She had never spoken of her family, only that they had died of fever when she was a girl, and she had been raised by a distant aunt. She had hated talking about the past. Elias Ashworth. Elias Thorne. He had changed his name, but he was Eleanor's brother. The puzzle pieces didn't just click into place. They exploded, reforming into a picture of monstrous clarity. Thorne wasn't just a businessman consolidating power. This wasn't about land or money. It was about revenge. A deeply personal, calculated vendetta against the man he blamed for his sister's death. Jake sank onto a crate, the paper shaking in his hand. Every move Thorne had made was an echo of Jake's own past. He'd targeted ranches with connections to Jake's old cases. He'd used fire, the very thing that had destroyed Jake's world, as a weapon. His veiled threats about family debts and man-made tragedies were not abstract warnings. They were intimate promises. Suddenly, another memory surfaced, sharp and clear. A silver locket Thorne wore on his watch chain, one he'd toyed with during their dinner. Jake had seen it glint, but thought nothing of it. Now he remembered. It was a matched pair. Eleanor had an identical one, a gift from her long-dead mother. It had been lost in the fire. Or so he'd thought. Thorne wasn't just attacking the town. He was systematically dismantling Jake's world piece by piece, just as his had been dismantled. And Clara, the woman who was slowly pulling him back into the light, was now the biggest piece left on the board. "Jake, what is it?" Clara asked, her voice filled with concern. He looked up at her, his face a mask of dawning horror. "It's not the town he wants, Clara," he said, his voice hollow. "It's me. And he's going to come for you to get to me." The sandstorm hit just before dusk, a monstrous, roiling wall of ochre dust that swallowed the sky. It descended upon Redemption, not with the grace of weather, but with the fury of an invading army, scouring the streets, rattling windows, and driving every living creature to shelter. For Jake, it felt like a portent and the world outside reflecting the storm that had been unleashed within him. The knowledge that Thorne was Eleanor's brother had changed everything. It had recast Thorne from a simple villain into a figure of tragic, twisted grief. But it also made him infinitely more dangerous. His motivations weren't rational. They were born of pain and a thirst for vengeance that had festered for years. Jake knew Thorne would make his move under the cover of the storm. It provided the perfect chaos for what was to come. He'd tried to get Clara to leave town to ride for Fort Huachuca until it was over, but she had refused. "This is my home, Jake," she had said, her jaw set. "I don't run." Her courage was a beacon, but it was also a liability. As the wind howled, Jake sat in her small adobe house, every sense on high alert. He had barricaded the door and windows, but he knew it was a futile gesture. Thorne wouldn't come through the front door. The attack, when it came, was from an unexpected quarter. A section of the adobe wall near the fireplace suddenly crumbled inward, and the mortar weakened by a carefully targeted blow from outside. Dust and wind filled the room. Before Jake could react, 3 of Cutter's men scrambled through the opening, guns drawn. The fight was brutal and close-quartered. A chair splintered, a table overturned. Jake moved with the desperate efficiency of a cornered animal, but he was outnumbered. As he disarmed one man, another slammed the butt of a rifle into his side, sending a spray of agony through his ribs. He staggered back, gasping for breath. From the swirling dust in the breached wall, Elias Thorne stepped through a specter in the gloom. He was no longer the polished businessman, but a grim avenger, his face streaked with dust, his pale eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "It's over," Ryder Thorne said. Jed Cutter appeared behind him, dragging a struggling Clara, her hands bound, a gag stuffed in her mouth. Her eyes were wide with fury and fear. Jake's vision tunneled. The sight of Clara helpless in their grasp ignited a rage that momentarily eclipsed the pain in his side. He lunged forward, but Cutter put a pistol to Clara's temple. Jake froze. "I wouldn't," Thorne warned, his voice calm amidst the storm. Eleanor was impulsive, too. A family trait, it seems. The casual mention of his wife's name from her brother's lips was a profound violation. "Let her go, Thorne," Jake snarled. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it has always been between you and me," Thorne agreed. "She is merely the final lesson. The lesson you failed to learn the first time. That everything you touch, you destroy. Everything you try to protect, you lose." He gave a signal to Cutter. "The old Silver Queen mine. At the top of the canyon. Bring him." The Silver Queen was a collapsed maze of tunnels and shafts, a scar on the mountainside, abandoned for 20 years. The storm was at its peak here, the wind a physical force that threatened to tear them from their feet. Thorne's men shoved Jake forward, his hands now bound tightly behind his back, into the gaping mouth of the main tunnel. Inside, the roar of the storm was muffled to a low, mournful moan. Lanterns cast long, dancing shadows that turned the mine support beams into skeletal ribs. Thorne had Cutter position Clara near the edge of a deep black shaft, a sheer drop into the earth's guts. "An appropriate stage for our final act, don't you think?" Thorne said, pacing before Jake. "A place of ghosts and forgotten hopes." He stopped and finally looked Jake in the eye. "Do you know why I hate you, Ryder? It's not just that you let her die. It's that you never deserved her. She was brilliant, vibrant. She saw the world in color, and you are a creature of shades of gray. A man who understands only duty and death." "I loved her," Jake said, the words tearing from his throat. "You loved the idea of her." Thorne roared, his composure finally cracking. A quiet, dutiful wife waiting for her hero to come home. You smothered her. You tied her to this dusty wasteland, while you chased your own glory. He gestured to the mine shaft where Clara stood, Cutter's gun still pressed to her head. Now you get to watch it happen again. You get to see the price of your interference. You will live with this failure just as you have lived with hers. Thorne pulled his own pistol, a silver-inlaid Colt, and aimed it at Clara. But he didn't fire. He looked at Jake, a cruel, calculating light in his eyes. He wanted Jake to break. He wanted to witness his despair. The guilt must be a heavy burden. Ryder Thorne taunted. Knowing that if you'd just been home, if you hadn't been so obsessed with your tin star, she would still be alive. Does it keep you up at night? The smell of the smoke? The sound of the timbers collapsing? Every night, Jake admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The confession seemed to please Thorne. Good. But in that moment of Thorne's gloating, Jake saw his chance. His captors, focused on the drama, had grown careless. The man holding him had loosened his grip. With a surge of adrenaline, Jake threw his weight backward, slamming his captor into a rotting support beam. The man grunted, losing his footing. Simultaneously, Jake kicked out his boot, catching another of Thorne's men in the knee. The man howled and went down. Jake spun his bound hands useless and charged Thorne, leading with his shoulder. He crashed into him, sending them both tumbling to the mine floor. Thorne's pistol flew from his grasp, skittering into the shadows. "Get him," Cutter yelled, but he was too preoccupied with Clara to intervene directly. Jake and Thorne scrambled for the gun. Thorne was faster. He snatched it up, but as he brought it to bear, a section of the mine ceiling, weakened by the impact against the support beam, gave way. A shower of rock and dust rained down, separating them. Jake used the moment to his advantage. He got his feet under him, and ran toward a pile of discarded mining tools. He found what he was looking for, a rusty pickaxe. Gripping it awkwardly with his bound hands, he turned to face Thorne. The sandstorm howled through the tunnel entrance, and the ground trembled. The mine was becoming unstable. "It's all coming down," Jake yelled over the din. "Just like your plan." Thorne rose from the dust, his fine suit torn, a trickle of blood running from his temple. He looked feral, the mask of civilization stripped away. He raised the pistol, taking careful aim at Jake. "This ends now." But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Drop it, Thorne." Sheriff Miller stood at the tunnel entrance, his arm in a sling, a shotgun held steady in his good hand. Behind him were Clara's ranch hands, and a half-dozen townsfolk armed and ready. Clara must have gotten word to them before she was taken. Cutter, seeing the tables had turned, made a fatal mistake. He shoved Clara toward the mine shaft, intending to use the distraction to escape. But Clara was a fighter. She stumbled, then spun, driving her elbow hard into Cutter's side. He grunted, his grip faltering for a second. It was all Jake needed. He threw the pickaxe. It spun end over end, not a lethal throw, but enough. The heavy wooden handle caught Cutter squarely in the chest, knocking the wind out of him and sending him stumbling backward. He teetered on the edge of the shaft, for a heart-stopping second, his arms windmilling before he fell into the blackness with a scream that was abruptly cut off. Now it was just Thorne. He was trapped between Jake and Miller's shotgun. His face was a canvas of disbelief and fury. He looked at Clara, safe. He looked at Jake, defiant. The vengeance he had so meticulously planned had crumbled into dust around him. He began to laugh, a broken, unhinged sound that echoed strangely in the collapsing mine. "You still don't understand, do you, Ryder?" He choked out, his eyes wild. "You think you were the failure? You think the fire was your fault?" He raised his pistol, but he didn't point it at Jake or Clara. He pointed it at his own temple. The fire wasn't an accident. He screamed over the groan of the dying mine. "I started it. I was going to frame a business rival, be the hero who rescued my sister from the flames. But it got out of control. So fast. I panicked. I ran. I left her in there to die." The confession hung in the air, more shocking than any gunshot. The weight of a year's worth of guilt lifted from Jake's shoulders in an instant, replaced by a profound, hollow pity for the man before him. Thorne's entire vendetta had been a monstrous projection of his own unforgivable failure. He had been punishing Jake for his own sins. "I couldn't live with it." Thorne whispered, tears streaming through the grime on his face. "But I couldn't let you live without the blame." With a final shuddering sob, he pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening. In the same instant, the main support beam overhead finally gave way, with a sound like a giant's cracking spine. The entire tunnel began to collapse. "Jake," Clara screamed. Miller yelled from the entrance, "Get out of there now." Jake didn't hesitate. He ran to Clara, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the rapidly shrinking point of light that was the mine's entrance. Rocks and timber rained down around them. The ground shook violently. They burst out into the raging storm, just as the entrance to the Silver Queen mine collapsed completely, sealing Elias Thorne and his secrets in a tomb of their own making. Jake stood gasping in the stinging, dust-filled air, holding Clara's hand, as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had just been torn down and rebuilt. The storm raged on, but for Jake, the internal tempest that had driven him for so long was finally blessedly silent. He was free. The storm broke, just before dawn. As the last of the wind died down, a clean, rain-washed light spread across the valley, turning the dust to mud and laying the ghosts to rest. Jake emerged from the temporary safety of the sheriff's office, Clara at his side. The townsfolk who had stood with them at the mine were already at work clearing debris from the street, their movements slow but purposeful. A fragile sense of community fractured by Thorne's machinations was beginning to mend. Sheriff Miller, his good arm wrapped around a cup of coffee, watched them from his doorway. He caught Jake's eye and gave a slow, meaningful nod. It was an acknowledgement, an absolution, and a welcome home, all in one simple gesture. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet rebuilding for redemption and for Jake. Thorne's empire, built on lies and intimidation, crumbled without its master. The deeds to the ranches he had acquired were found to be legally questionable, and a territorial judge eventually returned the land to its rightful owners. The town, free from his shadow, began to breathe again. Jake stayed, helping Clara and the other ranchers restore what had been damaged. The work was hard, physical, and honest. It grounded him. Each nail he hammered, each fence post he set, felt like an act of atonement and a step toward a future he hadn't believed he would have. He and Clara never spoke of what had happened in the mine, nor of the fragile thing growing between them. They didn't have to. It was there in the shared glances over a morning coffee, in the easy silence, as they worked side by side in the simple, profound comfort of each other's presence. One clear autumn morning, Jake saddled his roan and rode out to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. He stopped before a simple wooden marker that read, Eleanor Ryder. Beloved wife. He had avoided this place for over a year, the pain too sharp, the guilt too heavy. But today was different. He dismounted, holding a small object in his palm. It was the silver locket recovered from Thorne's effects. The symbol of a past he now understood not as his failure, but as a shared, unbearable tragedy. For a long moment, he stood there, the cool metal a weight in his hand, a final link to the life he had lost. The old instinct was to leave it here, to bind himself to her memory, to remain anchored in his grief. Instead, he closed his fingers around it, the sharp edges pressing into his skin, and slipped it deep into his pocket. It was a part of his story, but it would no longer be its ending. He knelt and placed a single wild desert primrose he had picked on the ride up onto the soil of her grave. It was a small, stubborn flower, one that bloomed in the harshest of conditions. A symbol of acceptance and of new life. He stood feeling a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet release that was not about forgetting, but about forgiving. Forgiving Eleanor's broken brother. Forgiving himself. He turned and his breath caught in his throat. Clara was waiting for him at the cemetery gate, the reins of her horse held loosely in her hand. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes held a world of understanding. She had known where he had to go, and she had given him the space to go alone. But she had been there to wait for his return. They didn't speak of the future in grand terms. There were no promises of forever, no talk of marriage or houses. The world was too uncertain for such things. But as he walked toward her, and she turned her horse to walk beside his, a silent understanding passed between them. Theirs would be a life built not on the ashes of the past, but alongside its memory. Together, they started down the hill, their path leading them not away from the ghosts, but back toward the town of redemption, toward the slow, steady, hopeful work of building something new.